Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This video is brought to you by First Detachment Nutrition. Battle tested, expert formulated. Use discount code AB10 at checkout for 10% off. All right, folks. Big Paul here today with the one and only Paul Carter, hypertrophy expert and educator. Paul, I've been looking forward to having you on here for a while. I stumbled into Paul because we were talking shit about the wrong Paul Carter on my podcast, and then Paul reached out to me. I was like, damn, dude, I feel like an ass now for talking about the wrong Paul Carter. But I've been listening to Paul's stuff since then, and just great stuff. And it goes back to some of the principles and stuff when I worked with Dante Trudell, we were talking about briefly before the podcast. But Paul, how's it going, man?
It's going good. And for anybody who doesn't have a reference to what you were just talking about, I highly encourage them to go back and watch that episode because it got sent to me and somebody said, watch this unfold. And it was so funny and I laughed so hard. So basically the backstory was, you guys had brought up, I was talking about rep ranges and doing sets of like 4 to 5 to 6 reps for muscle growth. And you and your crew were kind of like dookie on me. And you're like, well, let's look this guy up. So you look you look up Paul Carter like on Instagram, and it's this guy doing like this weird functional type kind of stuff, training like ladies or housewives and stuff. And your guys are like, why the hell is this guy talking about this stuff? He doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. And stuff. Like, I remember dying, and somebody finally goes, dude, you guys are looking at the wrong guy. So for anybody who hasn't referenced that episode, it's pretty funny. I encourage everybody to go back.
Well, that is evidence that we do these things live, at least those, and anything can happen. People love trying to get me to talk crap about other coaches and other people, and I have a rule now where I just stay away from it.
That's funny that you bring that up. That was something you asked me before we started. Anything is off limits. I think that's a huge drama thing people are addicted to with social media now.
Yep.
Is we've gotten away from wanting to discuss ideas, data, science, that kind of stuff. And it's become like a let me shit on people match. And one thing I don't do, there's a lot of people that come after me all the time. I get people make really like hateful, nasty stuff about me, but I actually don't make any content attacking people. The only person there's only like one person I've ever, if I openly dislike somebody, I say openly dislike this person. But I can disagree with somebody, a principle they're talking about with training, and it doesn't mean I dislike that person. And I think that's misconstrued across social media a lot, that if we disagree on a training principle, it must be we're mortal enemies.
Right. Yeah, no, and people love to stir up the drama stuff. And ultimately, we're all after the same thing. We're here, we're meatheads. We're trying to grow muscle. We're trying to get better at what we do. And one of the things you and I were talking about offline is, I really miss the days of the message boards, because a lot of that crap just got filtered out. It was, you had to get in there, basically earn your money and establish some value, and then the guys would take you seriously on the message boards. And there was just so many good quality conversations we had on these message boards that led to a lot of the information that's out there now. And people would debate ideas. We would debate it respectfully. And if you didn't, then you got your ass handed to you. You were out of there.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about before we started, was that when you went into a message board, like whether it was Intense Muscle or whatever we were posting back then, you had to actually write something, of noteworthy, that somebody would sit down. And the other thing I think about that now, Paul, that we're talking about it, is that the attention span back then had to be longer, because somebody had to, number one, write the actual message out. And then somebody had to actually sit down and read what you wrote and then kind of apply some critical thinking to that. And if they were going to have a retort, then it had to be a well thought out retort. And then people would kind of go back and forth. And for the most part, it was generally respectful across the board. And people, like you said, were just searching for the same thing. We're all searching on, how to get better, how to grow muscle, how to do this from a longevity standpoint, and all of that kind of stuff. And now what I think is lost in all of that is people have very little critical thinking skills. I don't know if you know this, but they have very little. The critical thinking aspect, I think, is almost gone. I can post up a simple exercise and somebody will say, will ask a question that people always come back and say, Paul responds like an a-hole. They don't understand when I'm asking a question back, I'm actually trying to understand how you arrived at asking your question first. And that's how my mind works. I've talked about that in my own podcast. I'm not asking you a question like in an aggressive way. And I understand online it comes across that way. And I've just given up on trying to reframe these things. But what I'm trying to do is, can we back up one step and you help me understand how you got to that question? Because there's a question before that most likely, if you ask that one, that you would probably either be able to answer yourself or I could answer. But the critical thinking aspect is for the most part gone. And then people, I mean, I put up captions and I'm famous for saying, did you read my caption? And nobody reads a caption. So a long time ago, and in these terms, that's like a year and a half or 2 years ago. But somebody said, you just need to put voiceovers. So then I put voiceovers and captions on videos, and people still ask the same question.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't matter. It really just doesn't matter. I feel like this. I feel like that the people who really have desire to learn and grow that knowledge and all that kind of stuff, they're already doing the reading. They're already out there. People ask me, it's like, where do you learn all your stuff at? I'm like, I have the same Google that you do. I have the same Google Scholar that you do. You have access to all the same stuff. The difference in you and I is that I'm willing to go sit and read for 12 to 16 hours and learn what all this stuff does, where you just want a sound bite so you can go argue with somebody on social media.
I sit every night, man. I look at studies. I can't tell you how many books I've read on training and nutrition over the years. And I try to surround myself with smart people too, people that are smarter than me, and learn from them. But you're completely right about the critical thinking thing. That's one thing like I'm really trying to impart on my children is ask questions, the Socratic method. Using that, ask questions and try to walk through thought processes on things, all the possible outcomes of different scenarios and things like that. I grew up, my grandfather was a Freemason, and that was one of the things that the Freemasonry teaches is critical thought. And that was like a big part of my mindset. I never, always ask why, be respectful, and try to parse through the possible scenarios in different situations and the potential outcomes from them. But yeah, you're right. Most people don't have the attention span for it. And part of it is, I hate to get completely off track here, is, my ex-wife was an educator, but in the American education system, you're not taught to think critically. It's all just regurgitating information that you were told from a textbook. There's actually no critical thought taught in schools, and it's kind of a travesty and a crime, to be honest with you. And that's why I find it very important, and I try to ask questions. You'll never hear me speak, almost never hear me speak in absolutes about things.
That's really cool, man. When I went through therapy, one of the things that my therapist taught me, he was really big on reframing your language, because your language has a direct effect on your neurological wiring. And one of the things he was huge on was not using absolutes. And he's like, every time, and I just said one, but each time that I would use absolute, he would literally point at me and get me to try to reframe that stuff. And that's hard to do because we use them so often, but it does help even in your writing, even in your thinking and your speaking. If you can kind of get away from using stuff like always, all the time, never, stuff like that, and reframe that, you will start to challenge your own thinking. When you're doing this stuff, because that's what it does. You're like, well, if I say always here, it means it's 100% of the time. And he had like a tier of questions you could go through, where each time that you would go through it, you would arrive at the bottom and realize that an absolute is almost never true. But it creates a really weird paradox in your mind.
Yeah, and when you start thinking in absolutes, you lose all potential for critical thought. You're not going to ask questions. You're not going to consider other people's ideas. It's a dangerous way to think, and it's one of the things that I really try to steer away from.
That's the fact that you're trying to impart that on your kids and help them understand that, dude, that's such a massive gift to give them as a father, to say, if there's any one thing you can do is like understand when you're using absolutes, and then what it's doing to your critical thinking ability and your mindset when you're approaching situations. I mean, it really is bigger than people realize.
Yeah, and that's it's part of the Socratic method. I don't know. I don't know how much if you've read Socrates or any of it, but the Greek way of thinking, the ancient Greek way of thinking was to ask questions, keep an open mind. It's sort of a verbal ping pong match, really, and that's how you arrive at truths. And a lot of times those things change too. Like I look back at things I said even last year, and I'm like, God damn, that was wrong. Or
And that's okay. The other thing about social media, I don't know, Paul, if you've had to go through this, but I've been around for a while, and I mean, you have too. But if you say something, there's people out there that they seem to have like photographic memories, and they can remember you said this one
oh
thing
yeah,
this time 7 years ago, and if
yep,
you say anything different than that now, they will say, "But you said this," and I'll be like, "Dude, that was 2012." Like, am I allowed to change my opinion since 20, like in the last 11 years? Like, they will bring up that stuff. But you wrote this
yep,
article back in whatever and said this. I'm like, but we've got like 3,000 studies that have come out since then. And that's what we thought at that time. I never criticize, and I said never then. Rarely, I rarely criticize someone for just doing a 180 on their stance. If we've had some data that's consistently come out and been reproduced and reproduced and reproduced, and they're like, hey guys, I'm going to change my stance on this one. I respect that.
yeah, me too. I think it's a sign of intelligence and flexibility. And usually, people that are entrenched in their ideas tend to be not always, but tend to be morons and fragile egos. It's more difficult for them to admit that they were incorrect than it is to accept a new idea.
Yeah, I read the my haters. I have legit haters now, and I read my
Oh,
haters and say something
that's
like,
part of the gift of social media.
it really is like the amount of people that I blocked on a daily or monthly basis, and I have a whole army of people I block. I'm like, well, you don't ever tell people why I blocked you. They always just act like, well, I just asked Paul a simple question, and he blocked me. I'm like, well, you're leaving out like the whole paragraph, the other part there where you insulted me, and I just don't have time for that stuff. But they will say stuff like, well, he contradicted himself. I'm like, well, if I change my stance on something and I give you the data as to why I changed my stance, that's not me contradicting, that's correcting myself. And self-correction is a perfectly good part of growing your knowledge base and being flexible and that kind of stuff. And I like you said, I don't think anybody out there that is really striving to continuously seek the truth in these fields and find the best methods and approaches and that kind of stuff, if they're sticking to a stance that was there 10 years ago, then they haven't done their homework. And if they're not willing to admit, okay, we have data now that shows that some of these things are not quite what we thought they were, then that's a problem. Like, I mean, I still had to battle. I've picked my battles intentionally on some of these topics for the past few years because of the fact that a lot of this knowledge and stuff needs the framework of it has to be completely rewired. One was just a simple aspect of telling people muscles not doesn't grow by being torn down and grows back bigger. I mean
Yeah,
that the Paul, what's wild is the fact that when I first started saying that, I got so much hate. And I'm like, you guys really believe this? I mean, this has been debunked by so much research at
yeah,
this point. Like, no, it's not torn down. And the amount of weird stuff that I've read, and I've gotten so much hate. So people will do that. I'll say that, and then I'll get hate. I will literally get like hate, nasty DM messages. People do not realize the nasty amount of stuff people will send you through DMs or like right there openly on your page because I'm actually just educating you or giving you the information. Muscle's not torn down and built back bigger. That's not how it works. So, and you should be like, oh, okay, well then, do you have a data? Do you have something to help me understand this? So, and I'll do that. But once you start challenging these core beliefs, people take them very personally, like you're attacking their family.
yeah. They get emotionally attacked to it. I call it bodybuilding dogma. People are really passionate about nutrition stuff. Oh my gosh, it's an area where I battle people with bro myths all the time. Is his own nutrition, and of course, a lot of that's evolving as well. We things are constantly changing. We get new information, new data, and that's changing. But it's funny how like with it's training. It seems like with bros, it's training methodology and nutrition that they almost treat it like a religion.
Yes. And I think this is what I feel like occurs in this field. It's circling back to what we were talking about, I feel like once you're kind of put up on this pedestal by a lot of people on social media as being an expert, if you ever get found out as being wrong, it's almost like you're a fraud.
Yep.
Where, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yep.
So if you some people, instead of doing what we just talked about, saying, "Hey, I changed my mind on this because we have data," some people would just go and die on the hills they've been on, and they'll just keep dying on that hill. They just planted their flag down, and they'll keep saying metabolic stress causes muscle growth, or like the pump causes muscle growth, or this does that, or and I'll be like, that's none of that is true though. And then they'll just keep repeating it and just denying it. I'm like, dude, it's okay to say that there was a time we believed that stuff, because there was a time for about a decade where people theorized that some of these things happened, and here was the data that led them to believe that. And then it's okay to say, well, data has come out since then, and we've tested this more thoroughly, and we kind of have a deeper understanding of some of these mechanisms. And now, like, because of that, like, I'm going to go with what the data really shows now. But I feel like what happens is that once somebody creates this ideology, and the ideology, it's like they get these yes men, and it's tribalism. I think a lot of what I talk about too is like tribalism. So if you get a big following and there's
Yep.
tribalism, and then now your tribe will just come to show up with their pitchforks and their axes and stakes and be like, no, we said this and our leader said this and this must be true. So it's like literally continents of people who have ideologies about training and nutritional beliefs, and they go to war with each other.
Right.
And it's not always about the truth. It's literally just about my tribe fighting your tribe.
Yeah, and that's what it boils down to. And it always, like, for me, like, the illogical nature of it, like, I think, like, with diet, like, becoming just aligned with one diet, like treating it like dogma. It's like a carpenter only having a hammer in your toolbox. I mean, why wouldn't you consider all possible options to achieve goals? It's like, when I work with clients, I don't use one single diet for every, if I have a person has severe metabolic disorder and is obese, I'm not going to give them the same diet that I am for a 270-pound bodybuilder that I'm trying to fill out for a show. It's a completely different approach.
Do you remember Dave Fisher, the bodybuilder?
Yes. Yeah, I remember Dave. Yep.
Yeah, Dave was one of my favorite bodybuilders. I thought he had a great physique.
Yeah, Dave was awesome.
Yeah, Dave was awesome. Remember, he wrote for, was it Flex? He had that article. It was an article in Flex.
Flex, yep.
It was Flex. He had this really great story one time that stuck with me forever. And he was talking about how this kid wrote him letters multiple times, and this kid wanted to be a bodybuilder and aspired to be a bodybuilder, and bought every bodybuilder magazine and looked at all the pictures and just dreamed and idolized looking like that. And then the kid said something to the effect of, but then, like, I'll get into a depression and go and drink a gallon of chocolate milk and eat, 20 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And he was like 400 or 500 pounds or something. So Dave, like, personally worked with the kid. And he's like, the first thing that I did was I didn't have this kid go to chicken, rice, and broccoli. He goes, the first thing I'd have him do is go from, say, chocolate milk to, say, skim milk. And then I'd have him go from eating, like, instead of eating like a whole loaf, we'd pare it down to, like, a half a loaf. Just like, really, and I'm like, they're smart, but it's common sense stuff. And it's like you're saying, everybody's going to need different approaches in those areas. I see the training aspect. I see that because I don't really get into the nutrition stuff anymore, because I really focused the last few years on physiology and biomechanics. But I see the training aspect 100%, where guys take this wellness competitor sent me her coach's routine. Like, it was a few months ago, and it was the wildest thing I'd ever seen. It was like 5 sets of 20 for this, and then 4 sets of 12 for that. Just all these random numbers just plugged in. And I'm like, I always want to understand. I would sit down with this. If I could sit down with those coaches, I'd be like, I want you to explain to me why your programming looks this way. And like, what's the goal here? Why are you training the muscle at this length with all these movements? And why are you using this rep range? And why are you doing it in this sequence, and so forth and so on? Because all of those things matter in training. So with the nutritional approach, because I don't get into that stuff anymore, but I do remember when I was more involved in that stuff, it used to be, and I think it made a comeback recently. I'm really good friends with Alan Aragon. He's like family. And I think Alan used to battle, it was the insulin to obesity thing with Gary Taubes or whatever his name was,
Yep.
or Fong and all those guys and that kind of stuff. And I think that's kind of made a similar, like a little bit of a comeback lately, where it's the
Yeah, it
insulin.
has.
It hasn't, because I feel like
Yeah.
I've seen it pop up here and there again.
Yeah, it's popped back up. If that were true, bodybuilders would be fat getting on stage. All those guys are hammering insulin. But it's different with somebody who has metabolic disorder than somebody who doesn't, right? So if we have somebody that's severely insulin resistant and dyslipidemia and all these other problems, there's other things going on. You're probably not going to want to eat a bunch of carbohydrates.
True, right, exactly, absolutely. And I remember just in with the nutritional stuff, me and Joe Bennett were talking this one time about this. When Joe used to do, I don't know if he still does diets for people, but he's talking about how he said he worked. You remember he trained with Ben Pekulski for
Yeah.
he was like, Ben could eat like 500 grams of carbs and just immediately store all of that shit as straight glycogen. Like he goes, if I would have eaten 500 grams of carbs like Ben, he's like, I would have never gotten in shape a day in my life. He goes, but Ben could do that. And you have to understand, like, everybody has kind of those different things going on with their system. And some of that takes trial and error just to see what this one person can respond to and one can't. There was another bodybuilder I remember, when we talk about going into peak week, just how different these things could be. And, even how some people carb up on different carb sources peak week. And it's wild how different that can be. I remember this one person realized like oatmeal worked for them. And I was like, I could never carb up on oat. Can you imagine carving up on oatmeal?
No.
They figured out oatmeal for them would really fill them out. And then another guy figured out it was tortilla wraps was like that he could fill out on. And that was the only thing you get them filled out. And then other people can do like fat loading and a combination of carb and fat loading to fill out. There's a that comes in with that. But from the hypertrophy side of the field and like the actual physiological side of the field, the reason why that I kind of got away from the nutritional stuff and don't talk about it as much anymore is because I felt like that it's become probably a bit more important for everybody to kind of find a lane they're going to be in and just kind of stay in your lane a bit. And like, okay, this is what I work in. So when people ask me nutritional stuff, I'm like, I did kind of a brain dump. It's a little bit like anabolics. Once I got off anabolics, like I can't tell you shit about really like cycles or stuff anymore. Like whenever you post about, I'm like, ooh, that's cool. That's interesting. And I told you before we started, I was like, here's a guy that's like approaching cycles in what I feel like looks like an intelligent manner. Because you're like, take a little test, use test as your base. And then if you're going to run this, use a little bit of that. Whereas, dude, back when I was on, it was wild. Like it was wild what people were taking. Like people would not believe. I mean, I'm sure you've probably heard some of these cycles guys were running back in the day when I was competing in powerlifting. It was insane. I mean, insane. I figured out a couple of things drug wise from competing. I don't think people like to hear this stuff because they have some hero worship going on with certain people and they don't like to believe this stuff. With bodybuilders, they're hyper responders, right, to steroids. So you get a guy like Kevin Levrone who can take 400 milligrams of test and he's 250 pounds ready for the Olympia stage in 3 months. With powerlifters, it's whoever can take the most and not have side effects. So that's literally, here's what I'm telling you about these. I don't care what anybody says. This is what I'm going to tell people. The guys in powerlifting who were the strongest guys when I was competing, for the most part, not all, we're going to get back to that. For the most part, the guys that were the strongest and breaking world records were the guys who could run those massive cycles and tolerate them. Because they would be taking so much stuff. I would think to myself, dude, I couldn't even run a gram of test without having problems. Like just feeling horrible or running an oral with like low back pumps that caused me to where I couldn't even squat for more than a few sets. So the guys that I found that were putting up the massive numbers were the guys that could just run tons of stuff and either not have side effects or could deal with the side effects. I was not one of those people.
Yeah, and this all goes back to genetics. You need certain elite genetics to succeed at sports. So like, for example, the ability to tolerate the drug load that is a genetic,
totally
thing. Yeah, like I'll see guys that have completely fucked up blood work from 250 milligrams of test, and then dudes that'll run 3 grams of gear, and they look perfect. The ability to eat and properly absorb nutrients, and how your body handles the digestion, and how your body handles the food is a unique genetic component. How your joints are put together, leverage is a unique genetic component. For bodybuilding, like muscle bellies is a
Can't
unique
change
genetic.
stuff like insertion points and stuff like that. I mean, there's all of this stuff at those top levels of anything comes 100% comes back to genetics. And I feel like that's also another thing people do not want to really fully grasp, is that if you are going to be like an IFBB pro top level competitor, you'll know the first time you run probably your first cycle. You're
Yeah.
going to know I'm different than everybody else. Okay, so I'll tell a John Meadows story to give an example of that. So most people don't. Some people do, and some people don't know. John and I were like best friends for the better part of a decade. We were in Australia together doing the workshops, and I was teaching powerlifting stuff, and John was teaching bodybuilding stuff, and we were both running. John was still competing, doing competition. Now, he had not turned pro at the time yet. He was still trying to get his pro card. But we were running stuff. We were over in Australia, and John had a whole vial of equipoise, and he didn't want to waste it. So he literally was sitting in the hotel room, and he goes, I'm going to have to take this whole bottle of equipoise this week to not waste it. So I'm like, okay. And he goes, wait to see what I look like at the end of the week. He goes, my chest, he goes, will be out to here. And I go, okay. I kid you not. Every day that I woke up and I saw him at a meeting now for breakfast, he looked like a different person. He was literally bigger every single day. By the time we got to the end of the week, he wasn't kidding. Like his chest was literally like twice the size that it was 7 days prior to that. And so you can't train for that. There's no training regimen you can do for that. There's no eating regimen you can do that. There's nothing you can do for that. And I get these questions every day from these people who still have not kind of grasped this, that a guy can do everything wrong, but he'd be a hyper responder to drugs and look amazing. His training can be terrible.
Yep.
Paul Dillett, I think it was Dave Palumbo said Paul Dillett could have. He would be bigger than you mowing the grass. He would mow his grass and get on steroids and be bigger than you. So you need to stop using like pro bodybuilders training regimens as kind of like this. Here's how the proper way to train. And I still deal with that fight out of what I call like prep coaches or pro bodybuilder coaches who do training regimens. The guys that we actually have to look at to understand physiology are natural guys, because we need to understand what is going on with training and natural guys. And then I'll get the guys that are on drugs to go, well, we don't have studies on drugged up guys. I'm like, well, we have one. We have one where guys were able to take stuff and sit at home on 600 meg of tests a week. They had never done anything, and they grew muscle sitting at home. And people will say, well, that wasn't, I've heard this argument, that wasn't muscle, that was water, that was edema, that was this. I'm like, no, it wasn't, because they tested them 10 weeks later and they were almost as strong as the natural guys who had trained for 10 weeks, which means that was functional accrual tissue. That was actual contractile units.
Yep.
So they got almost as strong sitting at home, which means they were adding actual functional proteins.
I've seen that study.
Yeah, it's a great study. We need more of those. So those guys got as strong. And then the guys that were on the 600 megs of test that got to train, they were like through the roof compared to everybody else. Like it was absolutely through the roof. If you go look at the graph, if somebody doesn't want to read the whole study, you can go look at the graph. And the strength gains are insane. The guys that got to train and were on, their stuff was through the roof. And then the guys that were natural and were trained, I think it was 10 weeks. Here, their strength gains were like here, and then the guys that were on was like right. It was so close, which means the only benefit that the guys had that were natural for the 10 weeks were the neural adaptations that they got from actually knowing how to do the exercises. But the guys that were just taking the steroids got real functional proteins added that produce force, and that's why they were almost as strong as those guys. So where this muddies the waters for training is when I have had to get into these discussions with guys that train pro bodybuilders, and they say stuff to me like, I just know what works. I'm like, dude, you don't know what works. You do not know what works. I had one guy that works over in where's the overseas place? Is it Dubai?
Kuwait, over at
Equate. And this guy got into it with me, and he goes, it doesn't work that way. And I'm like, he said, you can't grow muscle on doing sets of like 5 reps. I'm like, Yeah, you can. What are you talking about? I'm like, every single study we've ever looked at with rep ranges shows when we're training to failure, it equals out to about the same. So there's a multitude of other factors that, happen physiologically with those rep ranges, but they're still set in that mindset of two decades ago. Like, if you're gonna, there's a hypertrophy rep range zone of like 8 to 12 reps, and you got to do this and you got to do that. But when you put guys who are hyper responders on drugs, they can do a mess of training, like just whatever, and they're going to grow.
Yeah, genetic outliers. I don't know why people look at an outlier. They'll see one person that has success and something and think that is the way that they should do it as well, and they are the worst people to model yourself after. A clear example of it, and one that people can actually see. I played basketball when I was younger, and this is a clear example of genetics. Is when somebody's 7 feet tall. You don't have to have the fundamentals of a good shot. You don't have to really do a whole. What is it, like 1 in 20 people that are 7 feet tall end up playing in the NBA? It's something like that. It's some crazy statistic. So Ronnie Coleman, whoever's Mr. Olympia, is probably the single worst person, or whoever's the most elite power lifter in the world, the worst person to model your training, diet, PED protocols after, because they can do anything.
Another thing, I posted up something on Instagram threads a while back, and I was like, what Arnold did not work. It worked in spite of what he did. He had tier 1 genetics. He took drugs. He had a high dietary adherence. He worked hard and was consistent for a very long time. So the results that he got was not due because he discovered some magical training style that was very effective. It was, if you take the average guy and you have him doing 40 sets of chest a week, training twice a day, and doing all the stuff that Arnold did, he's not going to look like Arnold. If you take somebody that tell him to go train like Ronnie, he's not going to look. Nobody's going to look like Ronnie. It doesn't matter. But even if you put them on what Ronnie was taking, now there's bits and pieces you could say from all of these guys. You could say, what are like common denominators? Things
right.
Like
common truths.
Say, what are some common denominators between any of these training styles that you can kind of take away? And what's funny about that is, then if you go back to the science and look at the science, you'll find those common denominators are going to fall right in line with kind of what the science is saying. It's like kind of a moderate amount of volume, because people keep pegging me as this low volume guy. And I'm like, I'm not a low volume guy. Like, in fact, I've outwardly said the stuff that Mike Mincer was saying at like the end of his career was so outlandishly stupid. I was just like, dude, are you really saying this stuff? Like,
well, he was all methed out at the end of his career. He was a smart guy, but he was mentally
if you
ill.
Go back to Mike in the 70s, he had some good ideas. Nobody does that. Like, I'm talking about Mike in the 70s. If you go look at Mike's routines in the 70s, he was doing 5 or 6 sets for a muscle group in a session, which I think is about right. And he was training most muscles twice a week. And then he said he and Ray, if he felt like, hey, we're a little bit too tired to train today, they would take an extra day off. This is just all smart stuff. And then they progressively overloaded their stuff. So it's weird. We keep coming back to kind of these things that work, and that's what they look like, right? And you and I were talking about that in the preliminary part of the podcast, was what I feel like Dante Trudell got guys back to focusing on when a lot of that was lost. It wasn't the extreme stretching, and it wasn't like a special split, and it wasn't all of this kind of stuff. What I feel like really got people to growing again was eating and focusing on progressive overload. And he got to people saying, you've got to eat and you've got to progressively overload your list. And when people started focusing, remember the logbook was like, you got to beat the log, got to beat the logbook, got to beat the logbook. And I'm like, well, if every week your mindset is, I got to lift more reps, or I've got to add load this week, guess what's going to happen over 3 to 5 years, bro? You're going to grow. There's nothing else that's going to happen. How do you think you drive adaptations?
Yeah, it's like we were talking about. He had a very simple approach. You remove all the possible variables. If you're eating enough food, if you're progressing your weights and your form is consistent and controlled, and he talks about putting yourself in a mechanical position for a hypertrophy. He talks about that all the time. Not getting better at cheating, getting better at placing the proper load on the targeted muscle for good execution. Good execution. Yeah. In summary, and if you progress your weights with controlled, consistent form with good execution, and you're body weight increases, there's only one possible outcome if you're not getting fat, and that's additional muscle.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you something real quick. You talk about people and their biases. Have you um, heard of the survivorship bias? This is something that I was talking with Dr. Mike Israetel about, and it's this phenomenon where people get hyper focused on the 1% that succeeds at something, but don't focus on the 99% that fail. And it's probably more important, if you're looking at things critically, to look at the 99% that failed and why they failed, not the one person that had success in that area. So, somebody like, let's just say Ronnie Coleman or Paul Dillard, for example, would be an example of that.
No, I mean, I haven't heard of that, but I ascribe to that 100%. In fact, I will give you an example of how that kind of shaped my powerlifting thoughts. Is that I hated guys. I never looked at guys. Don't want to use it. I hated guys. I hated when guys got propped up for big lifts when they had amazing leverages for that lift, because it taught us nothing about how to build that lift. The guys that I used to go to find was like, who really sucks at this lift and built it. So one of the guys that I was friends with was Kurt Karofsky, known as Captain Kurt.
Oh yeah, I know. Yeah, I know.
So Kurt and I were good friends. We became good friends. And Kurt had short little arms and had tiny little mouse hands. So the first time I ever met Kurt, I can tell you this: Kurt would have been a better powerlifter than Eddie Cohen, and Eddie would tell you this. Eddie will tell you this because Eddie Cohen and I are really good friends too.
Eddie's a good guy.
Eddie's a wonderful guy. I love Eddie to death. We toured in Australia too for a month. We had an amazing time. So Eddie will tell you the same thing. He said if Kurt wouldn't have little rat hands, he would have been better than him. But Kurt had these tiny. When I met him in person, and I have pretty big hands, but when I shook Kurt's hands, it was like shaking like a little baby toddler's hands. He's got the tiniest little hands, so he couldn't hold on to anything. So like he pulled 800 a couple of times, but Eddie always said if Kurt would have had just normal size hands, he would have destroyed me, because he was a better squatter, he was a better bencher, he would have beat me at everything. So, but Kurt couldn't hold on to anything. But Kurt was the guy you want to look at to go to build your deadlift. And people be like, "Why would you?" I'm like, because that's the dude just trying to figure out every way possible to overcome his shortcomings. And so he eventually did pull. I want to say it was in the high 700s or the low 800s. It was a really good deadlift, especially for somebody like that. The guy you don't want to look at for building legs, in my opinion, would be like a Tom Platz. Tom Platz had short femurs. When he would squat down, he had a perfectly vertical torso, so he had maximal knee flexion. He could load his quads perfectly. Well, if you're built like you, Paul, and you're a tall guy, you're like 6'4", or 6'5", right?
Hair under 6'2".
Oh, okay. Well, you look really tall, you picture. So either way, you're a tall guy, but you have longer femurs. The squat. So I'll tell you a guy I'm also good friends with, that I pounded on for years, is I can't remember his last name for some reason. Gary just went pro a couple of years ago.
G Unit on.
yes, Gary. Why can't I remember his last name? What's his last name?
Oh God, I'll find it out for you. But yeah,
animal athlete, Gary,
yeah.
Wonderful guy. I've been friends with Gary for a long time. So Gary had no legs forever. He had like the tiniest little polio stick legs, and he was stuck in this powerlifting gym. And I was like, dude, I can literally look at the way you're built, your anthropometry, and tell you are not built for squatting. And he's like, I'm in this powerlifting gym, bro, and they tell me I got to squat, dude. I got to get my big. And he doesn't talk that way. He's a great guy. I'm just make that up because that's how I hear meatheads talking in my head.
Gary's really smart, actually.
Yes, he's very smart. And so I'm like, Gary, you got to get out of that stupid powerlifting gym. You need to go do bodybuilding movements for your legs. You need to do leg presses and hack squats and do some reverse banded hacks and do like the stuff bodybuilders are doing to grow legs, bro. Like you can't grow with your squats. And the wild thing is, Gary finally got out of the powerlifting gym and went and did reverse banded hacks and leg press, all this kind of, and his quads grew. It wasn't because he did not have quads. Like his quads, he ended up having good quads and good adductors.
Gary Turner, that's his name.
Gary Turner. Yep. And he credits the fact that he stopped squatting. But it's like heresy if you say stuff like that to some circles online, because they'll be like, well, it worked for Tom Platz. I'm like, I don't give a shit what worked for Tom Platz. I don't give a rat's ass what worked for Tom Platz in terms of building legs. Tom Platz is another dude like Paul Dillett mowing the grass. Tom Platz could have done anything for legs. He had femurs this long. As soon as he squats down, his torso is just like this. And he's got full knee flexion and he's loaded perfectly at the knee joint.
Yeah, you can watch him squat and he's just like was born to squat. Like
born to squat. Literally, all of his leverages are perfectly born to squat. So I'm going to say, if I'm Tom Platz, you need to squat because that's a perfect lift for you. But if you're a Gary Turner, you don't need to squat. And that's almost like, that comes back to the whole, what we were talking about with the diet thing, is there's people out there that try to do a one applies to all kind of methodology. And then when people don't get results, then they say, well, that worked for Ronnie or worked for Tom or worked for whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't really matter, and it's the what did you call it? The
survivorship bias.
Yeah, the survivorship bias. So it's kind of like that is that 1% is always going to fall into genetic anomalies. And a lot of people do not realize that pretty much every champion that you look at in every sport in the world has a genetic anomalies that put them there.
Yep.
All
of them. The genetic outliers almost always. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I think I told you before, basketball is the clearest example of it. You can't, I think it was John Thompson that used to coach Georgetown said, you can't teach tall.
And the people who look at these people, this is the best way you can describe that is their thinking is, if I go play basketball, I'll get really tall. That's how backwards their thinking is.
Yeah, it's exactly how backwards their thinking is.
They're backwards. They're so backwards. They're thinking, okay, if I go play basketball, I'll get really tall. I'm like, no, really tall people go play basketball. They're good at it because they're already really tall. There's a runner. This was one of my favorites. I love the genetics anomaly thing. I love reading about it and hearing about it. Lance Armstrong had a lactate threshold, the ability to clear lactate.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
That was like 4 times faster than anybody else. It doesn't matter. Lance could have taken all the drugs in the world. He had a genetic gift that nobody else really had that made him elite. He could clear lactate like at a pace 4 times faster than everybody else. So he never got fatigued like other people did. There was another runner. Dude had never ran in his life, but it was like his 36th birthday. He got drunk at the bar. He was depressed. He had like an office space type job. And he did a bunch of shots and said, I'm going to go run 36 miles for my 36th birthday. He took off 36 miles. He'd never run before.
That's
just
crazy.
so happens his mechanics, and there was some other stuff I can't remember what it is. I think he had a similar lactate threshold ability clearance system, but his mechanics for running were so efficient naturally. He didn't have to do anything, that he could just run and almost expend no energy. So he just took off running and then ran. And he said, next thing you know, the sun was coming up and he was just still running and he wasn't even tired. So he just found out by accident, he just had like these mechanics for running that were so efficient that he could just run forever. And he's done like tons of ultra marathons, and you can't train for that. He just had that. And that's that 1% that you're like, dude, you can't, there's nothing you can do for that.
Well, it's like when I just saw, when I was at the Arnold Classic, I saw a Julius Maddox bench press.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe he's the world record holder for it.
I think he is now, right?
Yeah, for raw bench press. But he did I think it was 740 there, just playing around. And somebody was telling me that dude, the first time he ever did a bench press, he was doing 315 for reps. I mean, who does that?
Right. I told guys this. Guys asked me,
that's his baseline.
Right. Like when he walked in.
Yeah, that's his starting point.
And they're like, hey, try this out. And he's like, and he throws 3 plates on, does some reps. I'm like, that's pretty easy. I hate this. I'm like, okay, never mind. Like you can't, like it took me, I think a couple of years of training when I first started lifting, like to get to 135. Right. And guys will ask me.
Me too.
Yeah. The guys will ask me this. So I was natural for 20 years before I ever took anything. And I went from, I was 98 pounds when I started, but I was 225 by the time I was 18. So I had a pretty good ability to gain muscle naturally. So because like I wasn't that guy. Well, when I was 18, I was like 17 pounds and all those kind of stories. Like I was already in the two teens to 220s by 18 years old. But I'd learned how to eat pretty early. I'd bought Bigger Muscles in 42 Days by Ellington Darden. I don't know if you remember those
No, I
books.
don't remember that one.
And the biggest thing was the eating, man, is the eating. You had to just smash the eating. It was a lot of super slow training. And I remember I pushed from like 175 up into the two teens like that. And then like a year later, I was in the 220s. But when guys ask me if they're natural, now I was 14, but if you're like a 22-year-old or 25-year-old and you get into the gym and they ask me, how will I know if I have elite genetics? And I'm like, if you have elite genetics naturally, you'll know, you'll be one of the most jacked dudes in the gym in the first 6 months.
Yeah, you're the guy that's going to get accused of taking steroids when you haven't taken any.
Yep, exactly. And people, I'm like, dude, you're going to know. I'm like, nobody will have to tell you. You'll know in 6 months, you'll be like, I'm kind of good at this. Right? Like you're kind of like, I'm kind of good at this. So if you, when guys wonder, they're like, well, how will I know if I have elite genetics? I'm like, if you have to ask, you don't, because you're going to know if you go to the gym, you can almost do everything wrong if you have elite natural genetics. And in 6 months, people are going to be like, dude, are you on the sauce? Like you said, they're going to be like, are you on the sauce? And you're like, no, man. I've been going in and doing some chin ups and some dips and some curls. And I do a couple of lunges every now and again. And dude's like mega jacked. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah, I remember when I first started lifting in high school, people were accusing me of taking stuff, and I had never even touched anything.
I got that by the time I was 18, it was all over town in a small town that I was on steroids. I wouldn't even have known. We didn't have the internet, of course. I wouldn't have known where to get steroids. I had a Walmart concrete like lifting kit in my in the backyard that I used. So I read all the muscle magazines that I could read. I ate a lot. I finally got into a gym later. It helped to get, better equipment, stuff like that. But I just worked really hard. I got my parents to buy me weight sets, and I ate a lot of food and read, like you said, I read every book I could get my hands on at the time and worked really hard. I was lucky that when I was coming up, that was actually when Yates was in his prime.
Yeah, me too.
And I really,
how old are you?
Huh?
How old are you?
I'm 49.
40. Yeah, I'm 50. So we're same age group.
So when Yates was coming up, I really gravitated towards like his ideology, his methodology. I felt like he was a thinking guy about how to approach training.
I remember reading his Blood and Guts book. I'd started off, not to interrupt you, man. I read Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding.
Yep.
And I ran his training programs and his diet that was in the book when I first started off lifting, and I made no progress. None. And then I remember picking up Dorian Yates' Blood and Guts, and I started following that. And then I started making progress.
Yep.
I started making progress, and I'm like he really did he distilled things down to the essence of what I mean. There's some things I disagree with at this point, but he was on the right track, I would say.
Dorian was closer in the 90s to what we consider optimal training than anyone else by a landslide. Because he was getting people back to thoughts about let's get a stimulus going, and then let's progressively overload stuff, and let's use good movements and use them with good execution. You see how it's weird how we keep coming back to kind of the same thing, and then
progress those movements.
Yeah. And then in Blood and Guts was just like a game changer book, right? That was such a classic book. And then he just listed off, remember he had the section there, like here's kind of his go-to movements.
Yep.
Growing muscle. And literally, if you could just take those movements he put there and that part right there, and you could progressively overload those for your first 5 years of training, and you're going to be about as big as you're going to get naturally.
It's funny. We were talking about it yesterday. It seems that the best bodybuilders pick the same movements and they just stick with those movements and progress them over years. They're not constantly changing things. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't. I mean, now there's so many great machines, but Dorian sort of he was limited by what was available in his gym, and that sort of worked out in his favor. He had no choice but to progress and perfect those movements.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the big thing for me at that time, like I said, was that it seemed like Dorian, he would had that kind of that critical thinking ability, because he would read something at the time, and I remember his interviews talked about this. He would read something and go, well, that just doesn't make any sense. And then he would try to do you remember him talking about he would try to do the ultra high volume routines, and he would say the same thing. He was like, I just saw myself regress, and then I would be tired, my lifts would go down. And then he said, once I got back to every time he tried to increase the volume, he saw a decrease in performance. And he really used his gym performance. And I think more guys need to kind of get back into thinking about that, is that if your gym performance is not increasing, I'm sorry, you're not adding muscle. Like there has to be a metric that you're using to determine is functional contractile proteins being added. That's what hypertrophy is, the addition, right? Is the addition of either sarcomeres in a series or myofibrils in parallel. That's what hypertrophy is. So those are your functional units of proteins, and they produce force. So if you are not progressively overloading, if you're not getting stronger, you're not growing. Like there's no other way around that particular point. So it's this idea that I can go and I can do, that I can overcome not having to build strength with either doing volume or getting a forcing a pump or like metabolic stress, all that kind of stuff. Like it absolutely is it's chasing the dragon. Like there's none of that stuff that's going to lead you to larger sizes.
Yeah, I train with a little more volume now than I did when I was younger. But that part of that, like I try to explain to people, that doesn't mean I don't progress or I'm at the point where I'm at, like seriously, how much muscle am I going to add at 50 years old, to be honest with you?
People ask me that all the time. They're like, well, I still love to train. I think there's kind of a disconnect with the kids now that are chasing clout with social media. I don't know that they love training, Paul.
Yeah, that's what I've never understood about people that don't want to be in the gym. I'm like, I love being in the gym.
Yeah,
I go there. I'm there every day. I'm not, I may not be lifting, but I'm hanging out, talking to some of the kids I work with, practicing posing. I just love being around it.
Yeah, I don't think that these people that ask these questions, I don't necessarily think they love to train. So, I mean, I'll train until I'm dead, and I will still be trying to progressively overload whatever lifts I'm doing while I'm in the gym. And I still have progressive overload occurring at times.
Yeah, I do too.
And now it's not like when I was squatting 660 and benching 485 and incline pressing, 475 and overhead pressing. Like I'm on YouTube. My old YouTube, I was doing 365 press behind the neck, like deep press behind the necks. And I mean, I'm not doing that stuff. I have a torn pec now too, but I find stuff I can progressively overload and I still go after it. And whether or not I get any muscle, I don't really care. I still enjoy that stuff. And then people will ask, they're like, well, if you're not growing, what are you doing? I'm like, what do you mean? I'm training. Like, I don't understand your question. I'm training.
Yeah, that was one of the things that Dante Trudel, I learned from him. He was like, if you exhaust an exercise, or let's say you're getting a little beat up as you get older, just pick a safer exercise, change the rep range, and then work through it and master, for example, like I can't really do barbell presses anymore because my shoulders are just so fucked up at this point. Right. But, there's nothing stopping me from getting on, like we have a really nice Atlantis press at my gym and just, taking my rep range up and working my way up on that, progressing that up through a rep range. And I do a little more volume now. I keep a rep or two in the tank, mainly just because I don't want to get hurt. That's the main thing now. I feel, maybe I'm incorrect about this. I feel at my age that taking things to absolute failure probably is increasing risk of injury.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to give you with that.
What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so that's been a shift I've had over the last year. I don't think it is anything to do with the age thing. This is what, through all the data. So the guy that I work with, Chris Beard.
Are you going to tell me I'm a pussy, Paul?
No, I'm going to tell you you're smart. I'm going to tell you you're smart. So I have always been a train to failure,
Oh, I was too for years.
Like if you had a ref left in the tank, you were the pussy, right? Like that was it. You were the pussy. If you had a rep left in the tank, you're leaving gains on the table. Remember Mincer had those sound bites and clips where he's talking about how it's that last rep. And that last rep is the one you do where it turns on the muscle building mechanism. If you don't do the last rep, then you're leaving gains on the table. And it creates an actual protective mechanism for the muscle building process. Remember all those clips, right? That's not.
Well, your Mincer is spot on.
Right. It's pretty good, right? I actually whipped it out one day, like randomly. I'm like, wow, that really does sound like Mike Mincer. So the guy that I work with, Chris Beardsley, he's the best muscle physiology guy on the planet by a mile. It's not even close. And Chris has a really funny way of like nudging me into like what the actual data is saying, despite what I've been doing in training. And so Chris would told me for like, because we've been working together for probably close to 3 years now. And Chris told me, he goes, I think that last rep to failure really just creating more unnecessary fatigue. I don't think it's giving you much more. And that's at the peripheral level. So it's calcium ion related fatigue, which is really the worst kind, because the intracellular calcium ion accumulation is what causes all the apoptosis and muscle damage, and what's actually going to create then central nervous system fatigue due to the inflammatory responses. So Chris was just like constantly going on about, he just has this really soft way, kind of like letting me, he's like, I just think that last rep's not really worth it. And then I was the same thing. Oh, like, oh man, only people think that way are like pussies. So, like, that's not what I thought about Chris. But he would be like, yeah, I think that he just told me forever. He goes, I think 1 hour is about the sweet spot for where you need to be trained. So then probably over the last year, I started saying, I hit, how you get stuck there. And I do find this anecdotally, I think you'll find this to be true. You remember how you hit a plateau, you've been hitting failure. And then you almost find that you regress and you can't even hit that. And that was happening to me a lot. And I've pushed through that my whole life and done stuff to get around it and all this kind of stuff. So I thought, I'm going to do 4 reps. I'm going to do 4 reps, 1 RIR. And we could talk about the simulating reps model, because that was kind of what happened on the show where I was talking about you don't really need to do more than about 4 or 5 reps. So I said, I'm going to leave a rep off. I'm going to leave that rep off because Chris keeps telling me that's just accumulate. There's a significant amount of fatigue that comes on that failure rep where there's just a massive influx of calcium ions into the cytoplasm that's creating like significantly, that's where most of your muscle damage is coming from. And then you're having a lot of central nervous system fatigue due to that inflammatory response, due to that apoptosis and cellular death that's happening in the days after the trainings, right? So it's affecting those subsequent training sessions. So I'm like, I'm going to leave it off. I'm going to leave that 1 rep off. Dude, I had progressive overload go through the roof over the months following that. I'm like, I didn't even want to say anything at first. It's almost one of that moment you're talking about. You're like, wow, I'm really an idiot. I'm really an idiot. So there was I don't know if you remember this, the meta-analysis on training to failure came out.
Yeah, I looked at.
And then
I think Brad Schoenfeld, was it him that did it?
It wasn't Schoenfeld, but it was Eric Helms.
Eric Helms, yeah.
And a bunch of those, and it was the meta-analysis, and they found that most people were just screaming. They just scream. They just look at the headline and don't really read everything, and then they don't go through the individual studies. And I'm big on that.
Yeah.
So there was a finding in there that was really interesting, and it said if you're going to use higher reps, it's more important to go to failure. And that if you're using heavier loading, it's not quite as important. In fact, it might be more detrimental. And I was like, that
makes sense.
I was like, that's interesting. So the reason why is because with heavier loading, you have full motor unit recruitment right from the first step, right?
Yep.
You're a full motor unit recruitment. So if you're doing a set of 5 or 6 reps with a 5 or 6 rep max load, you've got full motor unit recruitment. You've already got a slowing of contraction velocity, which means you've got a high degree of mechanical tension that's happening in all those reps. You don't really need to you don't need to go to that whole ball busting failure it's kind of like Chris said, that last rep, and there's a multitude of other studies that look at going to failure and leaving 2RIR and then the subsequent days after and the amount of isometric contractions that can be done. There's always a significant degree of fatigue that's left over from the groups that are going to failure, right?
Yep.
So then the meta regression come out. And a lot of people did not read these. And then they're saying, see, going to failure produces so much more muscle growth. And I'm like, yes, but you need to read it. And it says, if you're going to use lighter loads and go to higher repetitions, it's more important. They found the same finding, the meta-analysis, that they're like, if you're using heavier loads, it's not quite as important because you've got full motor unit recruitment right out of the gate. So basically Chris had it all right, like 5-10 years ago when he was like putting together all of the physiology. He was like, if you're using heavier loading, you're getting maximum motor unit recruitment that you're going to get pretty much from the first rep. We're talking 88% of one rep max loading, somewhere around in there. And you already got a slowing of contraction velocity. So the amount of cross bridging happening between the actin and myosin is very, very slow. It's very significant. So you're going to get that high degree of mechanical tension. So if you're going to do high reps, and we laughed about this in one of our last podcasts, we're like, well, higher reps are creating a butt ton of extra fatigue anyway. So if you might as well go ahead and go to failure and get whatever stimulus you're going to get out of it anyway. So what I found in my training as I started adjusting was I stopped going to failure as much, Paul. And I'm telling you what, dude, for anybody out there, I know it's like you think it's a hardcore thing, and you got all these kids now and they're doing what I call this fake failure bullshit where they're like convulsing and having seizures all over the floor trying to get that last rep and all that stuff. Look, man, I trained to failure for like 30 something years. I definitely understand what training to failure is. I pretty much done it 90+% of my life, and I found a significant difference in terms of progressive overload in my recovery when I just left that one rep off. I didn't train really far away from failure. So I need to add the caveat in there. Now, I don't believe the bullshit that's going around now that it also gets spliced out there that you can train to like 3RIR or like 4RIR. I do not believe that. I do believe you need to be close to failure. I think you need to be able to accumulate enough sufficient mechanical tension within the training session that you need to get myofibral protein synthesis up to kind of near maximal levels, but you need to be able to keep fatigue at that minimum, because either fatigue within the training session is going to reduce motor unit recruitment, or if you have peripheral fatigue, the calcium ion related fatigue, which tends to occur as the training session goes on more and more, that's going to have that oppressive effect on central nervous system, basically fatigue, that motor unit recruitment fatigue in the subsequent sessions, which is why we see in those studies, in those later workouts, there would be that massive reduction in the ability to create isometric contractions. So what I think that people have they missed out on is, if you're going to train with like moderate to lighter loads, it probably is a little more important that you get right on top of like that failure. I definitely do not believe anymore in adding stuff like drop sets or strips or forced reps. I don't think that stuff's productive. I think most of that stuff, if you think about this, Paul, if going to failure and you kind of acknowledge that getting to failure is creating probably a little more unnecessary fatigue than you need in a training session, well, then if you just keep going with the whole partial reps and then the forced reps and all you're doing at that point is adding on a butt ton more fatigue that you're going to have to recover from.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just a lot more fatigue you have to recover from. Also, I mean, you can speak to this, but I would imagine that it's relative to load. So if you're the beginner lifter that's benching 135, that's way different than somebody like you or me doing 405, right? The amount of fatigue that you accumulate.
Yeah, there's a few things going on there, right? So like a beginner lifter, they have motor unit recruitment deficits. So like they can't get into that higher threshold of motor unit recruitment that we can. So we can get into recruit those fibers and those type 2X fibers or the type 2A fibers that are more susceptible to muscle damage. So the truth is beginners can train with more volume and recover better than advanced guys can. And a lot of people don't understand that. It's not the other way. Remember, it used to be called the other way around. When you're a beginner, do 3 sets of 10. And then as you become more advanced, you do like 45 sets of like 10 reps. And I'm like, no.
Yeah, that's what I've always thought too. It's the exact opposite for a beginner because you have to train your CNS to even be able to handle those loads, right?
Well, if as you the as you get stronger, right? The whole reason you're getting stronger is you're able to recruit larger fibers, right? In
Right.
the like the top of that motor unit recruitment, like basically the Henneman size principle of motor unit recruitment, where you're able to recruit larger and larger and larger muscle fibers. Like there's no such thing as hyperplasia. You don't add new fibers. Like you never add more. Whatever fibers that you have, you're born with. It's your ability to recruit those over time. So as you get
If you
stronger,
take enough GH, anything's possible.
that might be true. We haven't done that. But I've heard that hypothesis that that GH might cause hyperplasia. I don't think we actually have a study like looking at that, but I've heard that hypothesis. But from the natural guy's standpoint, whatever you're born with, what you got. So over time, you're able to recruit those larger and larger fibers. Now the issue is the more you're able to do that, those largest fiber types are more glycolytic. So they have the least amount of protective mechanisms against calcium ions. So they suffer the most amount of damage. So they can't take very much volume. And then once central fatigue sets in within the training session, you're not able to really even access those anymore. So whatever damage you do to those, you're going to do to those early on. Whereas the beginner, he's in a motor unit recruitment deficit. So he's not able to get up that motor unit recruitment kind of like scale, right? So he's not able to get to the top end of the high threshold motor unit pool. He's only able to get like so far up there. Well, most of those fibers that he can recruit are going to be more oxidative fiber types, type 1, and then hybrid fiber types like type 2A mixed with type 1 fibers and that kind of stuff. So those tend to be more oxidative and have higher mitochondrial density, and they're able to handle muscle damage better and have better protective mechanisms. So they can do more volume and handle more volume and continue to grow. And as they get stronger and are able to get into those larger fiber types, what actually happens is that ability to handle volume goes down because there's more muscle damage done, and then there's more fatigue that happens, so forth and so on. So you're right when you're talking about that. Like the beginner that goes in, and you can remember this from when you started, you could go in and do like 1,000,000 sets of bench press and like you felt fine. But now like you could probably go in and do like,
Yep.
6 sets for chest, and you're like, I'm toast, bro.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. I've always looked at it, maybe this is an oversimplification, it's sort of like knobs on an amplifier. If you have volume, you have intensity, you have load, and you have frequency. And if you crank one of them up, you have to adjust the others accordingly.